There are reckless political posts. There are unserious wartime takes. And then there are moments so absurd that the only reasonable first reaction is to assume someone must be joking. That is what made the Newt Gingrich story explode. In March 2026, the former Speaker of the House shared a post on X promoting an idea that sounded less like statecraft than apocalyptic fantasy. Instead of fighting endlessly over the Strait of Hormuz, the United States could carve out a new route through friendly territory using a dozen thermonuclear detonations. Mediaite reported that Gingrich amplified language describing a new waterway wider than the Panama Canal and deeper than the Suez. Snopes likewise reported that Gingrich shared a post advocating the use of nukes to create an alternative shipping route around the Iran-controlled choke point. Even by the standards of modern online politics, that was spectacular. Because Gingrich is not just another anonymous war hawk with a social media account. He is a former Speaker of the House, one of the most recognizable conservative power figures of the last half-century, and still a prominent political voice with a large audience. When someone with that profile shares a thermonuclear infrastructure fantasy during an active geopolitical crisis, the story instantly stops being random internet noise. It becomes a window into how unstable elite discourse can look when war, panic, and social media rhetoric collide. The Daily Beast described the episode as Gingrich, a prominent Trump ally, appearing to treat a nuclear canal idea as something worth elevating to millions of followers. But the scandal did not stop at the idea itself. Because the deeper people looked, the stranger the story became. Snopes reported that the proposal Gingrich shared came from a satirical article, and that a community note beneath his post later pointed this out. Mediaite reported the same basic twist. Gingrich circulated an article whose premise was satire, but his own post did not make that clear. And that changed the whole tone of the scandal. It was no longer just a question of whether a former top American politician had elevated a deranged nuclear concept. It became a question of whether he had mistaken satire for strategy, or worse, knowingly treated satire as useful wartime rhetoric because it fit the mood of the moment. That is what makes this case so perfect for a documentary scandal frame, because both possible explanations are ugly. If Gingrich did not realize it was satire, then a former Speaker of the House amplified one of the most extreme military fantasies on the internet without recognizing obvious parody. If he did realize it was satire, then he still chose to pump an insane nuclear idea into a live wartime information environment because it was dramatic, emotionally satisfying, and politically combustible. Snopes said it was unclear whether Gingrich knew the article was satirical, which means the safest conclusion is not certainty about his intent. The safest conclusion is that either version of the story is bad for him, and that is why this is not merely a story about a weird post. It is a story about judgment, about what happens when a former high-ranking politician sees an outrageous proposal involving thermonuclear detonations and decides that it belongs in public circulation, about what kind of political culture makes that feel normal enough to share, and about how war, panic, and spectacle can flatten the difference between a joke, a fantasy, and a message powerful people are willing to pass along as if it deserves to be taken seriously. The truly unnerving part is that this did not land in a vacuum. It landed in a moment when the Strait of Hormuz was already being treated as a global emergency, when shipping fears were escalating, and when rhetoric around Iran had become increasingly maximalist. That is the kind of atmosphere in which even a ridiculous idea can start to feel, to some people, like boldness rather than madness. And once that happens, scandal becomes inevitable. Because now the question is no longer whether the idea was insane. The question is why a former Speaker of the House thought it was worth boosting at all. Crazy ideas do not spread only because they are crazy. They spread because they arrive at the right emotional moment. And the Strait of Hormuz was exactly that kind of moment. By mid-March 2026, the Hormuz crisis had already become one of the most volatile pressure points in the world. Mediaite reported that Trump was trying to build a coalition to escort ships through the strait as oil prices surged past $100 a barrel. The Daily Beast similarly described the strait as effectively closed to normal traffic after Iranian action, with major consequences for shipping and energy. In that environment, the bottleneck was not just a line on a map. It had become a symbol of vulnerability, panic, and global economic leverage. That matters because when a strategic choke point starts to feel unsolvable, the public becomes vulnerable to fantasy solutions. Diplomacy sounds slow. Naval escort sounds limited. Economic adaptation sounds boring. But a gigantic cinematic answer, something destructive enough to feel mythic, starts to attract attention. That is how a nuclear canal idea, which under normal conditions would sound immediately laughable, can begin to circulate with real emotional force, not because it suddenly becomes practical, but because it matches the scale of public frustration. It sounds like the kind of answer people imagine strongmen should have ready when the old world order looks weak. Mediaite and the Daily Beast both placed Gingrich's post inside that wider Hormuz emergency atmosphere, which helps explain why the stunt landed so hard. This is where the story stops being about one politician and becomes about wartime escalation culture. Because once the emotional temperature gets high enough, politics rewards spectacle over seriousness. The question stops being, would this work? And becomes, does this sound dominant? The fact that the proposal involved thermonuclear detonations was not a bug in the attention economy. It was the feature. The violence was the point. The scale was the point. The fantasy of redrawing geography through overwhelming force was the point. That is why it traveled. And this is exactly what makes Gingrich's role so revealing. He did not invent the crisis. He did not invent the satirical article, but he helped bridge the gap between fringe spectacle and elite visibility. That is different from just having a wild thought. A fringe account can post madness every day and disappear into the noise. A former Speaker of the House cannot. When he shares something, he lends it status, even if only for a moment. He tells the audience, this is at least worth looking at. And with a story like this, that single act is enough to create a scandal. There is also a deeper pattern here. Wartime politics online has become a machine for rewarding impossible answers. The bolder the fantasy, the more it satisfies a public craving for emotional release. A blocked strait becomes not a logistics problem, but an excuse for imperial imagination. A dangerous maritime corridor becomes an invitation for people to fantasize about blasting a new world into existence. That emotional logic is childish, but it is powerful. And once powerful political figures start echoing it, the line between unserious fantasy and elite rhetoric begins to erode. That erosion is the real danger in part 2 of this story. Because the reason the Gingrich post mattered was never that anyone was realistically about to detonate a dozen thermonuclear devices to create a new canal. The reason it mattered is that the post made something fundamentally unserious feel close enough to serious that millions had to pause and ask whether a former U.S. leader had just endorsed one of the most extreme infrastructure ideas imaginable. Snopes exists precisely to step in when that kind of confusion becomes public enough to require a factual boundary. And once fact-checkers have to explain that a former speaker shared satirical thermonuclear canal content, the embarrassment is already complete. Because by then the joke is no longer confined to the article. The joke has reached the political class itself. Normally, the word satire functions as an escape hatch. It tells people to relax. It explains the exaggeration. It restores distance between the absurd and the real. But in this case, the satire twist made the story worse. Snopes reported that the article Gingrich shared was satirical and that it was unclear whether he recognized that. Mediaite likewise noted that his post linked to a source later tagged by Community Note as satire, while Gingrich's own framing did not say he was joking. That is devastating because it leaves him trapped between two humiliating possibilities. Either he failed to recognize parody, or he recognized it and treated it as useful political theater. Neither explanation flatters the judgment of a former Speaker of the House. And once you see that trap, the whole scandal changes shape. It is no longer mainly about thermonuclear detonations. It becomes a credibility scandal. What kind of political mind sees a headline about using nukes to blast open a replacement sea route and thinks, yes, this belongs in my feed? That is not a technical policy disagreement. That is a question about standards, about impulse control, about whether spectacle has become more attractive than seriousness, even to people who once occupied the highest levels of institutional power. The more you think about it, the uglier it gets, because Gingrich's status matters here. He is not being judged as a comedian, a meme account, or a random troll. He is being judged as a former top lawmaker whose reputation was built on the image of strategic seriousness. That reputation does not survive contact with this story unscarred. If he fell for satire, he looks reckless and unserious. If he knowingly rode the satire because it was politically useful, he looks manipulative and unserious. Either way, seriousness is the first casualty. Mediaite's framing sharpened the embarrassment by showing just how literal the shared language was. The waterway was described in grandiose engineering terms. The proposal was not subtle or nuanced or plausibly mistaken for conventional military analysis. It was maximalist, flamboyant, and instantly absurd. That makes the defense of innocent confusion much harder to wear gracefully. The more obvious the parody looks in hindsight, the more damaging it becomes that Gingrich elevated it in real time. And this is where the case becomes darker than an ordinary internet gaffe, because it shows how elite discourse can degrade under pressure. Once the emotional atmosphere rewards aggression, the outlandish starts to masquerade as imagination. The impossible starts to masquerade as boldness. Satire becomes hard to distinguish from the actual fantasies circulating among people who want more escalation, more punishment, and more signs of strength. The Daily Beast's treatment of the story reflects exactly that mood. The scandal was not just that Gingrich shared something absurd, but that the absurdity blended too easily into the surrounding war rhetoric. That is why the satire twist did not rescue him. It exposed him. It exposed how poor the filtering can become when a powerful figure sees something emotionally satisfying and decides that is reason enough to spread it. It exposed how fragile the line is between political theater and political nonsense. And it exposed something else, too. The online right's appetite for giant, punishing solutions is now strong enough that a satire piece about nuclear geography can pass, at least briefly, as the kind of thing an establishment figure might sincerely endorse. That is not just embarrassing. It is revealing, because scandals matter most when they tell you something true about the culture that produced them. And this one tells you that in moments of war panic, the old prestige of public office is no longer enough to guarantee restraint, judgment, or even basic skepticism toward ideas that should never survive the first 10 seconds of thought. The easy way to dismiss this story is to say a politician got fooled online. That is true, maybe, but it is nowhere near the whole story. The more important scandal is that the post fit the emotional logic of the moment so well that it did not instantly look ridiculous to everyone. That is the real warning sign. When a satirical nuclear infrastructure fantasy can circulate through a former speaker's account and still feel, to some viewers, like a plausible wartime thought experiment, the problem is much bigger than one man's feed. This is what war politics online now does. It collapses proportion. Everything has to be louder, harder, more humiliating, more total. A choke point is not just a problem to manage, it becomes an insult to be crushed. A rival state is not just an adversary, it becomes an object of theatrical punishment. The answer cannot merely work. It has to feel emotionally complete. That is why fantasy solutions thrive in these moments. They promise not just victory, but domination. And domination is always more shareable than competence. Gingrich's post fit that culture perfectly. Not because it was smart, not because it was realistic, but because it was cinematic. A dozen thermonuclear detonations, a new sea route, an impossible map rewritten by force. That is exactly the sort of image social media rewards when fear and rage are running high. It turns geopolitics into a blockbuster. It turns logistics into spectacle. It turns strategic frustration into mythic violence. And once politics starts speaking that language, public discourse becomes less about governing reality than about performing fantasy in front of an audience trained to equate scale with strength. That is why this story matters beyond Gingrich himself. It shows how prestige and absurdity can now coexist online with almost no buffer between them. A former speaker can post something that sounds like deranged science fiction, and instead of being filtered out instantly by institutional norms, it survives long enough to generate headlines, fact checks, ridicule, and debate. That is not just a personal embarrassment. It is evidence of a weakened political immune system. There is also something darkly modern about the way the correction arrived. Not through internal discipline, not through party elders, not through some solemn institutional rebuke, but through a community note and a fact check. That says a lot. It suggests that the old political class is now operating in the same degraded information arena as everyone else, where public correction comes from platform tools, internet scrutiny, and media ridicule rather than elite self-restraint. In some ways, that democratization of correction is good. In other ways, it is humiliating, because it means a former Speaker of the House can now be publicly educated by the internet about the difference between satire and strategic analysis. And that humiliation is part of the scandal, too. Not because Gingrich alone matters so much, but because he is a symbol of a generation of political figures who once represented institutional seriousness and now often sound like they have been absorbed into the emotional logic of the feed. The fact that this happened around an active Hormuz crisis only magnified the effect. The stakes were real. The energy market fears were real. The shipping disruption was real. And into that real crisis came a thermonuclear fantasy dressed up, at least briefly, as a shareable answer. That is what should stay with the viewer. Not just the laugh line, but the structure underneath it. A geopolitical emergency creates panic. Panic creates appetite for dramatic force. That appetite makes satire look almost serious. Then a political heavyweight shares it. At that point, the absurd is no longer safely absurd. It has entered the bloodstream of public discourse. In the end, the cleanest version of this story is also the harshest. No, the reporting does not support saying that Newt Gingrich formally proposed official U.S. policy to detonate thermonuclear devices and carve a new canal around the Strait of Hormuz. But the reporting does support saying that he shared and amplified exactly that idea on X, that the idea came from satire, and that it remains unclear whether he knew the source was satirical when he posted it. That alone is enough to make the episode scandalous. Because scandal is not always about illegality. Sometimes it is about revelation. Revelation of how shallow judgment can become. Revelation of how spectacle overwhelms seriousness. Revelation of how quickly political status can collapse into feed-brain behavior when war, panic, and performance all start reinforcing one another. That is what happened here. A former Speaker of the House, someone who once operated near the center of American institutional power, ended up circulating a fantasy about thermonuclear detonations reshaping geography. Then the internet had to step in and explain that the source was satire. Snopes did that explicitly. Mediaite emphasized that Gingrich's own post gave no clear hint that he was treating the idea as a joke. The Daily Beast framed the whole thing as a striking example of how far wartime rhetoric had drifted into the absurd. That is humiliating enough on its own. But it is also diagnostic, because the deepest problem in this story is not that satire fooled a politician. The deepest problem is that the political atmosphere had become extreme enough for satire to sound like something a major figure might sincerely endorse. That is why this case hits so hard. It is not merely a one-off embarrassment. It is a warning about a culture in which exaggeration, cruelty, and fantasy have become so normalized that the difference between parody and policy begins to blur in public view. And once that blur sets in, the damage extends beyond one post. It lowers the standard for everyone. It teaches audiences to expect theatrical absurdity from people who should know better. It rewards politicians for sounding emotionally satisfying instead of intellectually credible. It conditions the public to interpret giant, destructive fantasies as signs of toughness rather than signs of unseriousness. and it pushes discourse into a place where being corrected by a fact-check no longer feels like a scandal-ending moment, but merely another beat in the entertainment cycle. That is why Newt Gingrich is such a strong character for this story. He is not just the man who shared something ridiculous. He is the man whose status turned ridiculousness into news. A fringe user sharing satire would have vanished. Gingrich made it visible. Gingrich made it matter. Gingrich gave the public one of those ugly modern moments where people stop and wonder whether elite politics has become so emotionally deranged that a thermonuclear canal fantasy can travel upward instead of being laughed back into irrelevance. And maybe that is the real ending. Not that Gingrich posted something bizarre, but that for one ugly moment the internet had to ask a genuinely unsettling question. Had a former Speaker of the House really become the kind of figure who could look at satire about nuclear geography and treat it like a strategic idea worth sharing? Snopes could clarify the source. Mediaite could document the post. The Daily Beast could ridicule the spectacle. But none of that changes the core image. A veteran American political figure during a live geopolitical crisis boosting an idea about using thermonuclear detonations to blow open a new sea route. Once that image exists, it leaves a stain. Because the scandal was never just the post itself. The scandal was that satire no longer sounded far enough away from strategy to stop him from sharing it.